As the global aviation industry struggles to recover its footing and rebuild public trust, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, once hailed as a revolutionary symbol of technological progress and passenger comfort, finds itself repeatedly dragged into the spotlight for reasons that have little to do with innovation and everything to do with safety, oversight, and credibility. Recently, the Federal Aviation Administration issued not one, but two significant safety directives aimed squarely at this aircraft. Directives that sent shockwaves through both airlines and passengers because they revealed flaws in areas of design and reliability where mistakes cannot be tolerated. The first directive focused on an issue so basic, yet so vital, that its discovery immediately rattled regulators during inspections of Dreamliner fleets. Oxygen supply tubes for passenger emergency masks were found kinked in certain rows, meaning that in the event of sudden cabin depressurization, one of the most dangerous situations in aviation, some passengers might be denied the very oxygen that would keep them alive, even though the defect appeared only in certain middle row seats. The FAA deemed it completely unacceptable and issued an airworthiness directive that forced inspections across 119 Dreamliners in U.S. fleets, including those operated by American Airlines. What followed was a battle of timelines, with the FAA pushing for swift action and the airline lobbying for a slower pace to minimize costs and disruptions. Until a compromise was reached, airlines had 36 months to comply. But they had to fix the issue by replacing entire oxygen mask panels instead of attempting unreliable spot repairs, ensuring long-term safety. The second directive, however, arose not from preventive testing but from a terrifying, real-world incident in which a Boeing 787, flying between Sydney and Auckland, suddenly pitched nose down after a flight attendant accidentally leaned against a defective switch on the captain's seat, forcing the pilot forward into the controls and injuring more than 50 people in seconds. This was no freak accident, disposed a pattern of similar uncommanded seat movements, leading the FAA to bypass lengthy procedures and issue an emergency directive ordering immediate inspections and replacements where necessary. These incidents, though different in nature, point to the same uncomfortable truth. The Dreamliner's repeated entanglement and safety issues reflects a broader pattern of manufacturing flaws and quality control breakdowns at Boeing. Over the past decade, problems have surfaced across multiple parts of the aircraft, from fuselage joints to lithium-ion batteries, from faulty communication radios that can switch frequencies on their own to structural defects in the forward pressure. Bulkhead, an element so critical it literally keeps the aircraft intact at cruising altitude. Each time, Boeing has insisted the jets remain safe, citing their extensive flight hours, but each time the FAA has uncovered flaws serious enough to warrant costly inspections, factory reworks, or even grounding. The cumulative effect has been a steady erosion of public confidence in both the company and the aircraft itself. How could a plane once marketed as a marvel of engineering, carbon fiber composite airframe with quieter engines, larger dimmable windows, better pressurization, and higher cabin humidity evolve into a symbol of corporate corner-cutting and engineering oversight failures? Critics point to Boeing's cultural shift in the 1990s, when leadership moved from engineers to Wall Street-trained executives, shifting priorities from safety and craftsmanship to profit margins and faster production schedules. A change whose consequences are now visible in every new directive, every incident, and every congressional hearing. And while airlines calculate the financial costs of each inspections, sometimes as low as $850 per aircraft, other times ballooning into hundreds of millions when deliveries are halted, the real cost is trust, both from passengers who increasingly question whether they want to board a Dreamliner and from regulators worldwide who are forced to double-check every assurance Boeing makes. These problems cannot be brushed off as isolated glitches. They are warning signals of a deeper systemic weakness within Boeing's quality assurance and oversight mechanisms, the same weaknesses that allowed tragedies like the 737 MAX crashes to unfold in the first place. So as the Dreamliner continues to fly, carrying millions of passengers each year, the question looms larger than ever. Are these recurring safety flaws simply the growing pains of a complex, groundbreaking aircraft? Or are they symptoms of a corporate culture that has lost sight of its most sacred responsibility, protecting human lives at 35,000 feet Asterisk, as the aviation industry struggles to rebuild both its reputation and financial strength after years of turbulence, the story of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner has become one of the most fascinating and troubling case studies in modern engineering, a story that stretches from boardrooms to factories, from test flights to terrifying real-world incidents, and ultimately raises a haunting question. Can one of the most celebrated aircraft of our generation still be trusted to carry millions of passengers safely through the skies? When the Dreamliner was first unveiled, it was heralded as nothing less than a revolution in commercial aviation. The first airliner built primarily from carbon fiber composites rather than aluminum, lighter, stronger, more fuel-efficient, designed for comfort with innovations like higher cabin humidity, lower cabin altitude, and windows nearly 30% larger than traditional aircraft. Airlines marketed it as the dawn of a new era, an aircraft that promised to transform long-haul flying into a calmer, quieter, more restorative experience. But today, instead of being remembered only as Boeing's crown jewel, the Dreamliner is increasingly defined by recurring safety scares, FAA directives, and a long list of unresolved technical questions. The most recent FAA action involved not one, but two separate safety directives, one targeting oxygen systems that passengers depend on in the event of sudden deep, and the other targeting a critical pilot seat switch that, when defective, can transform a normal flight into a nightmare in seconds. The oxygen system issue might sound simple at first glance. Investigators discovered kinked oxygen tubes in certain passenger masks, mostly in middle-row seats, meaning that in a life-or-death emergency, some passengers would have no airflow at all. The FAA had no choice but to mandate full inspections across 119 Dreamliners, including American Airlines' fleet, sparking a tense debate over time. Regulators demanded a strict 24-month deadline. American Airlines lobbied for 48 months to save money and fold inspections into routine maintenance, and in the end, a compromise of 36 months was reached. The solution itself revealed just how serious the problem was. Instead of attempting delicate fixes on individual tubes, entire mask panels would be ripped out and replaced, guaranteeing reliability. While the financial cost of this directive was relatively low, barely $250,000 across all U.S. Dreamliners, the true cost lay in the chilling reminder that even something as basic as oxygen delivery system passengers instinctively rely on could be compromised by a preventable oversight. But while the oxygen issue was alarming, the second directive was terrifying because it followed a real-world accident. On August 20th, 2024, an LATAM Airlines Boeing 787 operating a routine flight between Sydney and Auckland suddenly pitched nose down, throwing passengers and crew violently through the cabin. Over 50 people were injured. Investigators traced the cause to a defective captain's seat switch, hidden behind the chair, which had been inadvertently pressed by a flight attendant. In a split second, the captain was crushed against the controls, and the jet nearly plunged uncontrollably toward the ground. Worse still, this wasn't a one-off freak accident. Similar reports of uncommanded seat movements had already been documented across the 787 fleet, pointing to a systemic defect. The FAA acted with rare urgency, issuing an emergency directive that skipped the usual bureaucratic process, demanding immediate inspections and replacements. No delay, no debate, no compromise. Safety had to come first. Yet these are only the latest chapters in a saga stretching back years. Since 2013, when the entire global 787 fleet was grounded after lithium-ion batteries spontaneously caught fire, the Dreamliner has stumbled from one crisis to another. Manufacturing defects in fuselage joints forced Boeing to halt deliveries for years, leaving over 120 jets stranded in makeshift shadow factories, where technicians struggled to rework them into compliance. Structural flaws in the forward pressure bulkhead, the part of the plane that literally keeps the cabin sealed at 35,000 feet, sparked FAA warnings of long-term fatigue and corrosion. Communication system bugs that caused VHF radios to switch frequencies without pilot input threatened to cut crews off from air traffic control during critical phases of flight. Each time, Boeing reassured the public that the jets were safe, citing hundreds of thousands of flight hours. But each time, the FAA uncovered evidence serious enough to warrant urgent inspection orders. The deeper story here, however, is not just about technical flaws. It's about a corporate culture that many critics say shifted dangerously in the 1990s. When Boeing replaced engineer-driven leadership with executives trained on Wall Street, from that moment, priorities changed. Quarterly profits began to outweigh meticulous engineering, speed of production. As the aviation world moves forward in an age of advanced technology, tighter regulations, and ever-rising passenger expectations, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner continues to stand as both a symbol of ambition and a mirror reflecting the cracks in modern aerospace culture. When the aircraft was first rolled out, Boeing marketed it as a game-changer lighter than anything before, thanks to its revolutionary carbon fiber composite structure, more fuel-efficient than its rivals, quieter, smoother, and friendlier to passengers with innovations like a lower cabin altitude to reduce fatigue, higher humidity to ease discomfort on long flights, and giant electronically dimmable windows that promise to change the way travelers experience the skies. Airlines rushed to place orders, and the Dreamliner became a bestseller almost instantly. But behind the glossy marketing and industry buzz, the aircraft's journey has been marred by an ongoing pattern of safety scares, regulatory interventions, and troubling signs of a company struggling to balance speed, profits, and safety. The FAA's two recent directives tell us everything we need to know about the thin line between innovation and oversight failure. First, the discovery of kinked oxygen tubes in passenger masks, a small detail that should never have slipped past quality control. Imagine being at 35,000 feet, turbulence shaking the cabin, a sudden depressurization tearing through the fuselage, and when the oxygen masks drop, the very lifeline you're depending on is blocked. That chilling possibility forced regulators into action, ordering airlines to inspect and replace entire oxygen panels on 119 Dreamliners in U.S. fleets. The battle over deadlines exposed the clash between safety and cost. The FAA wanted action in 24 months. American Airlines argued for 48 to minimize operational disruption, and the compromise landed at 36 months. For passengers, the timeline debate is meaningless. The only thing that matters is whether oxygen will flow when they need it. But for airlines, every month translates into millions of dollars in scheduling efficiency or losses. Then came the second directive, which shook confidence far more deeply because it wasn't hypothetical. IT was born from an accident that left more than 50 people injured in seconds. A pilot's seat switch, poorly designed and insufficiently protected, was triggered when a flight attendant leaned against it, forcing the captain violently into the controls and sending a Boeing 787 into a sudden nose-down dive. The fact that this wasn't an isolated case, but part of a pattern of similar incidents, raised the alarm from unfortunate accident to systemic hazard. The FAA had to issue an emergency directive, bypassing the usual slow regulatory process, demanding immediate inspections and replacements. It was a stark reminder that in aviation, the smallest overlooked detail, a misplaced switch, an unsealed joint, a kinked tube, can become a ticking time bomb when multiplied across hundreds of aircraft flying thousands of passengers every day. And the deeper we look into the Dreamliner's history, the clearer the pattern becomes. Since its introduction, Boeing has repeatedly faced embarrassing revelations. Lithium-ion battery fires that forced a global grounding in 2013. Fuselage joint defects that halted deliveries for years. A flawed forward pressure bulkhead that could corrode or crack over time. And software glitches in its communication systems that could cut off pilots from air traffic control at critical moments. Each of these issues on its own might be dismissed as a solvable hiccup, but together they form a troubling mosaic of recurring failure. Critics argue that these are not isolated flaws, but the symptoms of a corporate culture that shifted in the 1990s when Boeing elevated profit-driven executives over engineers, prioritizing speed and market share over precision and safety. That cultural shift played a central role in the 737 MAX disasters, where cost-cutting and secrecy contributed to crashes that killed 346 people. And many fear the same mentality continues to erode the safety net around the 787 Dreamliner. Airlines, regulators, and the flying public now face uncomfortable questions. How many of these small problems are still lurking undetected? Can we trust that fixes issued today won't be undermined by new flaws discovered tomorrow? Boeing insists that the Dreamliner remains safe, boasting of hundreds of thousands of successful flight cycles, but the growing stack of directives, inspections, and repairs paints a different picture. Even loyal customers like Qatar Airways admit that after implementing official fixes, issues such as faulty radios persist, fueling doubts. And passengers themselves are no longer silent. Public comments on FAA reports reveal deep skepticism, with travelers openly stating they would avoid flying the Dreamliner if given the choice. The stakes here are not just technical, they are existential. Every time the Dreamliner faces a new safety directive, Boeing's already fragile reputation takes another blow. Regulators face renewed pressure to tighten oversight, and passengers wrestle with the unsettling reality that the jet marketed as the safest and most comfortable in history keeps landing in the news for the wrong reasons. This brings us to the real heart of the story. Is Boeing still the engineering powerhouse that once defined American aviation excellence? Or has it become a cautionary tale of corporate hubris, where the drive for short-term profit has chipped away at the foundation of long-term trust? The 787 was supposed to redefine the future of flight, but instead, it risks becoming a case study in what happens when quality control falters in the age of mass production. And so we are left with haunting questions when the next emergency occurs at 35,000 feet. Will every system on board perform flawlessly? Or will another hidden flaw emerge at the worst possible moment? Are regulators catching every weakness, or are some defects slipping quietly through the cracks, waiting to reveal themselves in flight? And perhaps the most important question for the millions who will step aboard a Dreamliner this year is: Boeing still worthy of our trust? The Boeing 787 Dreamliner was once celebrated as the crown jewel of modern aviation, a plane that symbolized the future of flight with its sleek composite frame, fuel efficiency, quiet engines, and passenger-focused innovations. But more than a decade after its debut, the story of this aircraft has become something very different: a complicated saga of repeated safety scares, costly inspections, and deep questions about whether Boeing, once a name synonymous with engineering excellence, has lost its way in the pursuit of profit and speed. The Dreamliner's troubled narrative is not about one or two isolated incidents, but about a growing chain of problems, stretching across nearly every system: oxygen masks with kinked tubes that might choke off airflow when passengers need it most, pilot seats with hidden switches so poorly designed that a flight attendant brushing against them sent one aircraft into a violent nose-down plunge that injured dozens, fuselage joints assembled with errors so significant that the FAA halted deliveries for years, bulkhead flaws that could corrode or crack at altitude, and even communication radios with software bugs capable of cutting pilots off from air traffic control during critical moments. Each of these issues on its own could be explained as a minor oversight, a bump in the road of progress. But when you connect them together, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. An aircraft that promised perfection has instead been haunted by recurring signs of deeper systemic flaws. The FAA's recent directives highlight just how serious the situation has become. Airworthiness Directive, demanding that 119 Dreamliners in U.S. fleets undergo inspections and replacements of entire oxygen mask panels because regulators refuse to gamble on partial fixes, followed by an emergency directive with no delays, no appeals, no comment periods. After the terrifying seat switch incident proved the danger was immediate and real. These were not symbolic actions. They were blunt reminders that, in aviation, the smallest overlooked detail can mean the difference between life and death. And regulators had no intention of allowing airlines to treat them as minor inconveniences. Yet behind every directive lies a struggle between cost and safety. American Airlines pushed for 48 months to complete oxygen inspections so they could fold the work into routine maintenance, while the FAA insisted on 24 months to eliminate risk as quickly as possible. And the compromise landed at 36 months, a timeline that tells us as much about financial pressures as it does about engineering reality. But the deeper question is why these flaws keep happening in the first place. To answer that, critics point to Boeing's cultural transformation in the 1990s, when leadership shifted from veteran engineers to Wall Street-trained executives, and a company once proud of its obsessive safety culture became increasingly focused on quarterly earnings, shareholder satisfaction, and rapid production schedules. That shift, many argue, created the conditions for the tragedies of the 737 MAX program. where 2 crashes killed 346 people. And it continues to shape the ongoing crises of the 787. Passengers today may not remember the boardroom decisions of the past, but they feel the consequences every time a new directive is issued. Every time deliveries are delayed, every time a defect makes headlines. Airlines, too, are growing frustrated, with some, like Qatar Airways, admitting that even after implementing FAA-mandated software patches, Dreamliner radios still malfunctioned, raising doubts about the effectiveness of fixes and the depth of Boeing's oversight. As the global aviation industry strives to recover and grow, safety issues remain at the center of attention, especially when they involve modern, widely used aircraft. Recently, the Federal Aviation Administration issued 2 significant safety directives. What came as a shock, however, is that these directives directly target the Boeing 787 Dreamliner fleet. So, what exactly is going wrong with the Boeing 780? Just how serious is this issue? Let's dive in. The safety of airline passengers in moments of crisis, especially during sudden cabin depressurization, depends entirely on the flawless performance of emergency oxygen systems. That is why a recent discovery on the Boeing 787 Dreamliner instantly caught the attention of the Federal Aviation Administration. Investigators uncovered a troubling flaw. Oxygen supply tubes in certain passenger masks were found kinketed, a design or installation error that could choke off the very airflow meant to save lives. Though the problem was identified only in masks at some middle-row seats, the mere possibility of passengers being denied oxygen in an emergency was deemed intolerable. For the FAA, inaction was not an option. To confront this risk, the agency moved forward with a binding airworthiness directive, mandating full inspections across 119 Boeing 787 aircraft in U.S. airline fleets, including those operated by American Airlines AA. Far from being a knee-jerk reaction, the directive came after a painstaking consultation process in which regulators worked closely with Boeing and affected carriers, analyzing technical data and gathering expert input before issuing their final order. But consensus did not come easily. A sharp debate flared between the FAA and American Airlines over the timeline for compliance. While the FAA initially pushed for a strict 24-month deadline, AA countered with a request for 48 months, arguing that a longer window would allow the inspections to be folded into routine maintenance cycles, sparing the airline costly and disruptive unscheduled downtime. Finally, the agency rejected the 48-month proposal outright, but did soften its stance, extending the compliance deadline to 36 months. This compromise both safeguards safety and allows airlines to manage costs and schedules more effectively. On the technical front, engineers initially worried about the complexity of the fix. Straightening kinketed oxygen tubes inside mask housings seemed both impractical and unreliable. In response, the FAA approved a more decisive and elegant remedy. Instead of tinkering with individual tubes, airlines would remove and replace entire oxygen mask panels wherever the defect was found. This approach not only streamlined the repair process, but also guaranteed long-term reliability and quality control. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the directive, however, was its modest price tag. With estimated costs of $252,875 across all 119 affected Dreamliners, the measure ranks among the least expensive airworthiness directives in recent memory. However, this time the issue is not about cost, but about aviation safety. In this industry, even the smallest flaw, if left unchecked, can carry catastrophic consequences. By acting swiftly and decisively, regulators ensured that a potentially life-threatening weakness could be eliminated without imposing a crippling financial burden on the industry. Wait, don't forget to hit subscribe, because we know you're going to love what's coming next. Trust us, you won't want to miss it. While the directive concerning oxygen masks was largely preventative, the second directive focused on the pilot seat switch was issued in direct response to a terrifying safety incident. On August 20th, 2024, LATAM Airlines Boeing 787, operating a flight from Sydney to Auckland, abruptly pitched nose down, violently hurling passengers and crew. More than 50 people were left injured in a matter of seconds. The investigation uncovered a cause that was as unexpected as it was alarming. A critical switch controlling the captain's seat movement, located on the rear side of the seat, was found to be defective. Its protective cover had failed. While a flight attendant was working in the cockpit, they inadvertently leaned against the exposed switch, triggering the captain's seat to shift forward. In a split second, the captain was forced against the control panel, and the aircraft nearly plunged headlong toward the ground. This was not an isolated freak accident. Investigators soon linked the event to a broader pattern of similar uncommanded pilot seat movements reported across the 787 fleet. What initially looked like a rare mishap was instead evidence of a systemic safety vulnerability, one capable of endangering lives on any given flight. Given the severity and urgency, the FAA bypassed its usual rulemaking process and issued an emergency airworthiness directive. The emergency status meant there would be no lengthy public comment period, no delays, only immediate action. The directive required every Boeing 787 operating in U.S. fleets to undergo urgent inspection of its seat switches. Any switch showing signs of damage or wear had to be replaced without delay. This swift and uncompromising move underscored the FAA's resolve. No convenience, no operational cost, and no bureaucratic process could outweigh the protection of human life. By acting decisively, regulators not only neutralized the risk of recurrence, but also reinforced cockpit safety at its most fundamental level, restoring a measure of trust in an aviation system shaken by the incident. Adding to the FAA's recent safety directives, one critical dimension cannot be overlooked: the role and responsibility of the manufacturer itself. Meanwhile, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, once hailed as a symbol of innovation and a milestone in commercial aviation technology, now faces pressing questions about its quality control processes and overall reliability. When it first entered service, the Dreamliner was celebrated as nothing short of a revolution. Designed around passenger comfort, it introduced features that set new benchmarks for long-haul flying. Its advanced pressurization system keeps the cabin altitude at about 6,000 feet, well below the traditional standard, reducing fatigue and headaches. Higher cabin humidity helps ease dry skin and eye irritation, while windows nearly 30% larger than those on older aircraft feature electronic dimming instead of mechanical shades. Coupled with its aerodynamic design and quieter engines, the Dreamliner offers a cabin environment that is calmer, quieter, and more restorative. Notably, the most defining innovation was structural. It became the world's first commercial airliner built primarily from carbon fiber composites rather than aluminum, a lighter, stronger, and more fuel-efficient material. This leap in design was expected to redefine the future of air travel. Yet, more than a decade later, that image has been overshadowed by a troubling string of technical issues. What is most concerning is that these failures are not isolated events. They emerge across multiple components of the aircraft, from seemingly minor flaws like kinketted oxygen supply tubes to critical systems such as the captain's seat switch. This pattern points to a deeper and more systemic issue within Boeing's quality management framework. The oxygen mask anomaly, which at first glance might appear trivial, is in fact a stark reminder that even the most basic safety elements can be overlooked or inadequately vetted during design and production. But this isn't the first time Boeing 787 is in trouble. On March 2025, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration dropped a bombshell on Boeing, a new airworthiness directive ordering airlines to inspect the forward pressure bulkhead of the 787 Dreamliner, a structure so critical that it literally keeps the cabin pressurized at 35,000 feet. The reason? Investigators believe Boeing may have committed a series of assembly blunders. Gaps left unsealed, fasteners incorrectly installed, and key specifications simply ignored. These flaws might not bring down a plane tomorrow, but the FAA's warning was stark. Over time, they could snowball into fatigue, cracks, corrosion, or even catastrophic failure. And disturbingly, this is not an isolated case. It's just the latest entry in a growing dossier of problems haunting the Dreamliner. Since 2020, Boeing has repeatedly been forced to halt 787 deliveries due to manufacturing defects, particularly errors in the fuselage join. The company was even compelled to set up so-called shadow factories, off-the-books repair facilities, where more than 120 stranded jets had to be painstakingly reworked before airlines could fly them. The saga echoes an earlier scandal. In 2013, the entire global 787 fleet was grounded after lithium-ion batteries burst. Once marketed as Boeing's crown jewel, the Dreamliner has increasingly become a symbol of a quality control system in freefall. And the troubles don't stop there. In a little-noticed FAA filing earlier this year, regulators flagged yet another potentially disastrous flaw. This time in the Dreamliner's communication systems.